I've had this one on my shelf for going on 2 years now. This 2013 tie-in to AMC's The Walking Dead features the voice and likeness, of Norman Reedus, and follows his backstory before the show, I guess. But honestly, after playing this game to completion, I wish I had left it on my shelf because Survival Instinct is one of the most painfully dull and boring games I've played for this series. I've played some rough games, but being bad and boring is adding insult to injury. Made by Terminal Reality, the same studio behind the fan-favorite Ghostbusters game, Survival Instinct is the kind of game that has some really solid ideas. I was shocked to find out how many. Unfortunately, being a likely rushed tie-in with a shoestring budget, it clearly didn't have enough time to make something fun or interesting out of those ideas. You play as Daryl Dixon as he treks across the backroads of America on his way to his brother. The story starts with a bland, shoddy intro, and from there you get scant cutscenes, mostly of assorted survivors you encounter. Many of the cutscenes could easily be taken out of the game and nothing of value would be lost, as they consist of simply fading in a line of dialogue and fading out, which absolutely reeks of something needing to be cut for time or budget. The first big idea Survival Instinct has is this road trip premise. Instead of regular level progression, your stops are based on the need to gather new supplies, including food, ammo, and fuel. Additionally, you can complete side missions in some of the levels that will see new survivors with their own advantages joining your small squad. These light RPG and base managing elements are really interesting, and while thin, they echo games that would prove to be popular after this game, like State of Decay. The environments you traverse are also interesting, or at least they have the potential to be. There's something to be said for exploring a spooky abandoned campsite overrun with zombies, and there are plentiful small towns to scavenge supplies from. At least until you realize that you stop to scavenge for fuel in the same locations multiple times along your road trip, which not only ruins immersion, but gets boring fast. This scavenging gameplay is another interesting idea, replicating the supply runs you'd see in the TV show and actually forcing the player to balance inventory space while watching for zombies in cramped dark spaces. Like I said, this game has ideas. It's the execution that's lacking. Speaking of execution, let's talk about killing the dead. Executing zombies in The Walking Dead and leaving them even deader is of course the other main pillar of gameplay. Again, Survival Instinct is replete with ideas on how to set itself apart from an endless sea of zombie-slaying games. There is limited ammo, making for a classic horror survival feel and genuine tension when missing shots. There's an assortment of melee weaponry of varying lengths and damage, and the crunchy melee combat, revolving mostly around Condemned-style swinging and Left 4 Dead-style shoving, feels alright at first. I'd even go as far as to say the shooting, with a steady hand and generous auto-aim, is mostly satisfactory. The problem is the zombies themselves. On the best of days, zombies are not the most interesting enemies in video games. They're easy to program as mindless, shambling, swarming foes, which is why so many Steam asset flips prominently feature them as enemies. There are standouts like the fast swarm of games like Left 4 Dead or the animation-heavy and threatening zombies in Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake. Unfortunately, Survival Instinct hedges closer to the asset flip style of zombies. Now, these zombies, while slow, will swarm you, often seemingly from nowhere. They seem to constantly spawn in, so even if you've cleared every nook and cranny of a walled-in area, you could get blindsided by one. The blindsiding is also annoying as the developers go out of their way to put zombies behind doors where you might not look. The first time it jump scared me, I was cool with it. By the 10th time, it was just annoying. Many you encounter are intentionally placed facing away from you, allowing you to stab them in the head for a quick takedown kill. This also gets boring fast. Eventually a group of zombies will spot you and you're left with few options, mostly revolving around walking backwards until you've picked them all off with whatever guns or melee weapons you have available, or if you get caught in a mosh, you'll have to engage in this struggle minigame to escape being bitten. The minigame itself is fine and does a good job feeling like you're really struggling against a foe. Until you do it 5 times in a row, because once one zombo in a crowd dies, the next one is basically standing in line like an annoying child waiting for his turn on the teacup ride. They also aren't able to climb really, meaning that sometimes you can just stand on a car and pick them off one by one, which is not an exciting combat encounter, by the way. And this is basically the extent of the combat. There are other small ideas at play, like explosives you can place and blow up strategically, some distractions like glass bottles and flares to draw horde attention, and crossbows that allow you to pick up the bolts you fire, but other than these considerations, you're going to be scrounging supplies in various sweaty locales and wrangling the undead for most of this game. And I do mean sweaty. This game has a bizarre sweat filter that just drenches the screen when sand porta bridges get to going. Like, look at this stuff. This has to be a medical condition, right? Is that why he's always so shiny? When everything was wet in that Silent Hill trailer, was that just Norman Reedus' sweat? And as you've probably noticed, Walking Dead Survival Instinct ain't exactly a looker. Hand-waving aside the inconsistency of how dilapidated and overrun everything is so soon after a zombie apocalypse, the zombies mostly look fine, echoing the Greg Nicotero style of sunken eyes and starving corpses. But up close, and especially during struggles and executions, they look particularly lifeless. The texture models are muddled, details like hair and clothing are grainy and lack details. These visual critiques extend to the rest of the game too. The team really had no choice in color palette here. As a game based on a series that exists in a parallel universe full of desaturated beige, Survival Instinct would always be a gray-brown variety of shooter with more brown than gray. But for a 2013 game, everything looks dated and unpolished. This game came out a year after Halo 4, and while that is an intensely unfair example because of how different I'm sure the development budget and team sizes were, it gives an idea of what had been accomplished on similar hardware by this time. Survival Instinct generously looks like it came from somewhere in the 2007 to 2009 era. Honestly, I think something like Shell Shock 2 looked better, and that game definitely had one foot in the PS2 Xbox era. Lighting throughout is grainy, debris and details are ugly and flat, and most of the textures throughout lack detail, giving the game a whole lackluster and unpolished style. Again, I don't blame the developers, as these aren't uncommon shortcomings for licensed tie-ins on small budgets and quick turnaround. But it's yet another example of how Survival Instinct fails its own premise. In a best-case scenario, a game like this would be dripping with atmosphere, delivering something closer to the claustrophobic, dingy exploration of Condemned or Condemned 2, but in a sweaty southern drawl, like Resident Evil 7 years before we met the Baker clan. But as it stands, Survival Instinct is a limp, shambling mess of a zombie title. The combat is thin, the encounters repetitive and uninteresting, the environment's devoid of atmosphere and texture, and the story is barely a footnote. And all of this is a shame because there are ideas here. On paper, Survival Instinct is a solid experiment in linear FPS design that emulates the feeling of scavenging through the fallen world of the TV show. But in execution, its elements never congeal, making for a game that is, at its best, just passable, and in its worst moments, painfully dull. Going into this, you should know that Condemned Criminal Origins is one of my favorite games ever. Like, ever. Condemned was one of the first games I got on the Xbox 360. I have incredibly fond memories of playing it late into the night during the summer my dog had puppies, and I had to help them nurse. It was also instrumental in my now foundational love of psychological horror, and has undeniably influenced my creative work as easily seen in my Game to Dawn and Back. So, I love Condemned, which means that, yeah, it's gonna be pretty high on the list. Reviews are subjective after all, but that doesn't mean I think it's a perfect game by any stretch. I've probably played through Criminal Origins at least 10 times, so there's a lot I love and some stuff I don't. That being said, I want to say that in spite of its flaws, Condemned remains a wholly unique first-person horror experience, one that everyone should experience if you have a love of intense combat, atmosphere, and psychological storytelling. The game follows Ethan Thomas, a fake CSI officer in a shady, unnamed city who's been framed for the murder of 2 police officers and must track down the real killer. Along the way, he uncovers a mysterious wave of crime and insanity, and a serial killer at the heart of it all who appears to be hunting down other serial killers, using many of the investigations Ethan has headed for guidance. Condemned was one of the first games on the Xbox 360, and if there's one place it shows, it's in the storytelling. While the emphasis on cinematography and writing is head and shoulders above contemporary shooters like Call of Duty 2, the character models don't hold up. I've been involuntarily thinking about Ethan's giant blurry eyebrows for the better part of 15 years now because there are so many aspects of the characters that still have one foot in the original Xbox era. But once you get past the character models, well, you still have to put up with some wonky voice acting. But because you have distinguished taste, I know you would never hold voice acting against a great game, so I don't worry about it. Because Condemned Story is one of my favorite from the era, and is an intense psychological thriller that manages the not easy feat of hinting at a larger lore behind what the player sees, while giving very little information along the way. As you investigate the various dilapidated areas, there is a mounting paranoia that follows Ethan, and you by extension. It becomes clear that the story isn't just about a single killer, but something far more mysterious and sinister behind the scenes. But even if you don't delve into the collectible unlocked case files that detail the mysterious happenings in the city, Ethan's story and the small, focused cast of characters should keep any horror or thriller fan invested. You have a mysterious old man, Malcolm Van Horn, who I think Malcolm McDowell would be perfect fit for in a Condemned movie. It's like if David Lynch wrote Obi-Wan Kenobi, kind of guiding Ethan and kind of just confusing the shit out of him with stuff that doesn't make sense until you play the game a second time. Now, I had been debating including Condemned in this list for a while because while it is a first-person game, it's not a shooter in the typical sense. You do fire weapons, but by and large, Condemned is about balancing gameplay between sparse firearms with limited ammo and improvised weapons you find in the environment. There is little depth to the combat itself, but plenty of variety thanks to a wide variety of improvised weaponry and impressive AI. When Condemned came out, the enemy AI was a high point of praise, and it's still impressive today, even if you can see the strings being pulled behind the scenes. Enemies will fight each other, run from combat, hide and surprise you, and more. Thanks to plentiful combat animations, the AI always manages to be unpredictable, even dodging your swings, blocking, or jumping wildly into the fray, swinging for multiple hits if you're not careful. The melee combat also takes weapon weight and speed into consideration, making for some tense back and forth dances, especially as you find yourself against groups of enemies. The hit effects themselves are brutal and can even result in crunching bones and flying teeth. There's also your taser, which can stun most enemies and is particularly useful against anyone who pulls a gun, as you can run up, snatch it, and use it on them, which never gets old. The shooting itself is adequate, but this isn't Call of Duty. Weapons have a wide spread and are fairly inaccurate, which makes gameplay more tense as you need to get closer to effectively use them, and ammo is sparse. If you're judicious in how you use your firearms, you can usually string their use together through levels, relying minimally on improvised weapons. But for most new players, guns will be welcome treasures that are gone almost as soon as you grow attached. While there is some depth in the block hit gameplay and added by the taser, Condemned is not a very advanced game. The gameplay throughout can only be described as thin. You travel from place to place, avoiding tetanus, bludgeoning hobos and drug addicts, and occasionally engaging in what can generously be called puzzles with the game's various crime scene investigations. And the investigations, or at least the environments they lead you to, are the absolute highlight of the game. Condemned is rife with atmosphere. The dev team actually scanned and sampled real-world condemned and dilapidated buildings for many of the textures, which explains why everything looks so authentically grungy. Every surface of this game appears to be stained, goopy, or otherwise unlickable. You traverse subway stations, abandoned apartment stores, farmhouses, and more, and despite the fact that you're exploring a bustling city, the game always makes you feel like you're on the back foot, as if you've stumbled into a place you were never meant to be. Much like King Kong, Condemned uses a variety of clever amusement park ride-like strategies to help these environments stand apart, and I've intentionally kept some of my favorite moments hidden from this footage in case anyone hasn't played Condemned and will be inspired to pick it up. As you dive deep into the heart of a violence-infested city, you face off against a variety of vagrants and squatters, but these are not just regular homeless folks or drug addicts. You find yourself trespassing on the territory of violent killers and psychopaths left to prey upon the homeless and addicted populations. Many times these characters are ancillary to the main plot and are rarely mentioned in the main story. My personal favorite levels for this reason are the department store and secondary school. And there's something to be brought up about how this game hasn't aged well, because at its core, it looks like it's about a police officer beating up people who are largely coded to be mentally handicapped, addicts, or otherwise unstable individuals. But I think that's an overly reductive reading of what can more accurately be framed as an exploration on societal violence, whose cycles of violence affect most, and how thin the lines are between justice, self-defense, and vigilantism. Also, I'm not in the habit of canceling a game from 15 years ago for not being particularly woke. But those criticisms aside, Condemned remains something entirely unique in the genre of shooters and horror games, an unholy blending of the two. We don't get games from talented mainstream developers and publishers like this anymore, offering a tightly paced, refined gameplay experience. So if it's your first time diving in this Halloween season, turn down the lights, play it alone late at night, and put on a headset for good measure. Enjoy it, because there aren't many games out there like this one. While most shooter fans, and even fans of the channel, will think of the modern Machine Games Wolfenstein games at the mention of the franchise, there's one interceding chapter between id Software's return to Castle Wolfenstein and the New Order, the bizarre Raven Software-crafted black sheep of the Wolfenstein family, 2009's reboot simply titled Wolfenstein. Raven Software will be recognizable for fans of this series as the creator of games like Singularity and another co-creation with id Software, Quake 4. And honestly, this game isn't too far from some of the ideas in Singularity. You still play with physics and special powers to kill enemies and solve puzzles. You've got plenty of atmosphere and environmental storytelling and a classically cheesy high pulp story. And the extra pulp is really the lifeblood of Wolfenstein 2009, from the opening cutscene that feels like it could be ripped straight from an Indiana Jones story, with BJ infiltrating among Nazis before taking off in a stolen plane. It's clear that this is an entirely different breed from the in-your-face extremity of machine games take on the series. Don't get me wrong, it's still a very over-the-top game, just in different and uniquely charming ways. The story kicks off with BJ being sent to Eisenstadt, a small village overrun by Nazis who are trying to get a hold of some magical power. Turns out there's an alternate dimension called the Black Sun that can be used for said power, and the Nazis, led by General Deathshead, want it. BJ needs to put a stop to those plans by teaming up with various resistance groups like the Kreisau Circle and the Golden Dawn, a secretive order dedicated to preserving knowledge. I'll be honest, the story here is nothing to write home about. BJ is silent during gameplay, and in cutscenes he has very little personality. Likewise, the ally characters have very little to do aside from being mission givers, so when it came time for plot twists and betrayals, I honestly had a hard time remembering who was who. Aside from Death's Head, who's only notable for a distinctive appearance, the Nazis you disperse are mostly one-and-done bosses that you meet, they menace at you, and you shoot them in the face. The setup with the town, the Black Sun, and the different factions are merely duct tape to hold the gameplay experience together, and on that note, Wolfenstein 2009 performs gloriously. Like Rage, Wolfenstein isn't content to merely follow the footsteps of COD or Halo, and Raven really tried to do a lot of interesting things here, even if they don't always mesh. The first is the game's semi-open world. Between missions, you are free to roam Eisenstadt, though there's not much to do besides finding treasure, taking side missions, and traveling to the black market to upgrade your gear. But the inclusion of the open world helps the game and story feel more alive. As you traverse, there are Nazi patrols everywhere that you will scrimmage with, and the intensity of these street fights increases over the course of the game. As BJ's infamy grows, the Nazis bring out heavy hitters, and the resistance fighters in kind will be more ready to join these small-scale battles. There are even small, seemingly randomized moments that play out, like one time loading into an area there was a 6-man patrol passing right by me. I died after fighting them, but the next time I loaded in, there was a different patrol in a different area. There are also small moments like aiding captured resistance fighters before they're executed, and all of these dynamic interactions play into helping this feel like a city under siege that nicely matches the rest of the game's flow without ever resorting to open world padding like climbing towers or overindulging in fetch quests. The main reason for this open world is player choice in missions, which is both a blessing and a curse. The curse is that because of the already flimsy characterizations and unmemorable introductions these characters get, going back and forth between different mission givers only makes what little story there is feel more fractured. While Wolfenstein could have easily been a fun, memorable high-pulp adventure story, the different mission choices means the story never finds a focus and the entire narrative falls flat as a result. The good thing is the missions themselves, which are incredibly varied in both gameplay and setting. But before we go into that, we need to talk the core gameplay gimmicks, because like Singularity and Legendary, Wolfenstein hails from the early 360 post-Bioshock era of superpower design, which turns out to be another mixed bag of blessings and curses. Early in the game, BJ gets a magic amulet that allows him to tap into the Black Sun dimension, or the Veil, for a variety of powers. Using said powers expends energy that can be replenished at various points around the levels, and while the recharging points are generally supplied well, it can be frustrating when they're not, especially when later encounters require powers to basically survive. The powers include being able to see hidden objects, pass through certain walls, slow down time like Fear, and power weaponry for more devastating effect, and a front-facing shield that can be upgraded to reflect bullets. It's a great moveset that makes for some really unique approaches to combat, and when the game balances decent enemy variety in a number of places to recharge said powers, rotating between them all feels great. Using Empower to blast through enemy shields, then swapping to your shield to take out a group of small grunts mindlessly firing at you, then recharging and going slow-mo to take down a heavy trooper that requires pinpoint aim. Solid enemy variety helps keep the gameplay interesting, and plays nicely into the balance of superpowers players are given without ever feeling too easy. Even the boss fights, with the exception of a few frustrating final boss stages, use these powers well to keep players on their toes. The problem with these powers is the Veil itself. When players activate a Veil power, it cloaks the screen in the Veil aesthetic, which retextures the world around you in neon teal accents. It looks very cool, but also causes constant gameplay slowdown, which during intense firefights is not ideal to say the least. So the magic powers are fun, but have their technical drawbacks. What about the weapons? Well, Wolfenstein is an absolute gem of the era in that it allows you to carry your whole armory at once and switch on the fly, utilizing a radial weapon reel a la Doom 2016 that even stops time. The weapon selection mechanic here is perfect, and in an era where every other series, including old-school alumni like Duke and Quake, resorted to 2-weapon loadouts, it's an absolute breath of fresh air. Along with a plethora of upgradable powers, it also gives players more opportunity to experiment, mix and match, and find a gameplay rhythm that works for them. So many games from this era limit the best weapons to specific points, which means you end up using the same 2 to 3 basic rifles or shotguns for the runtime, but Wolfenstein says, to hell with that, give me the sampler platter, and I love it for that. But then the high pulp comes in, and the rest of Wolfenstein's armory gets a 1940s comic book makeover. You've got a Tesla gun that stands in for a shotgun as a close quarters gameplay solution. The Tesla gun overcharges Nazis until they pop and can be upgraded for further reach and arcing between targets, but even the base version is satisfying as hell. If I had one complaint, it's that the Nazis don't splatter like with a Fear railgun, but it's small potatoes. Then there's the BFG-style railgun that fires an annihilating blast of energy that will reduce even tough foes to literal bones. And what's more, the game gives you plenty of ammo. You've got a proton beam that shears through Nazis and disintegrates them, a flamethrower if you'd like them charbroiled, and you can always pick up and throw canisters of Veil energy to levitate groups of enemies to mix and match powers. Now that is what I call an air fryer. The arsenal is so wonderfully balanced, allowing you to mix up approaches to long and short range combat without ever feeling constrained. Enemy sniper getting you down, you can slow down time and snipe him back, or just hip-fire a rocket launcher at him. Groups of enemies, overpower a flamethrower and let loose, or walk through a wall to flank behind them and drop a grenade. The level design alternates wonderfully between opportunities like these as you traverse underground Nazi laboratories, airships, dig sites, farmhouses, and more. There's so much variety between level design and gameplay that I didn't once get bored, which might also be why I couldn't bring myself to care about the thin story. With so many options, all of which can be upgraded for further devastation, this might be one of my favorite Nazi-slaying armories in games. There's not a useless or bad weapon in the bunch. The weapons of Wolfenstein are the picture-perfect definition of all killer, no filler. I almost forgot to mention how unexpectedly colorful the game is. While the Veil powers saturate everything in shades of ecto-cooler, even with the Veil of Vision turned off, Wolfenstein is a gorgeous game with wonderfully colorful lighting that isn't afraid to have saturated blues, greens, oranges, and reds. It might not seem significant, but it's another example of how it stands apart from the pack of its time, in a variety of ways that are significant now but were overlooked in 2009. While character models up close suffer from an early Xbox 360 polygon deficiency, the environments are wonderfully detailed from start to finish and chock full of destructible boxes, papers, and physics objects that make the hectic combat encounters pop off the screen, even if the frame rate can't always handle the excitement. If there's one other major complaint I have, it's a rare one, and that's the achievements. The game divides its achievements between single and multiplayer, but half of them are no longer attainable because servers are down, which is annoying, and the single-player ones are mostly for collecting every single collectible, which is a tall order that may require multiple playthroughs. It's unfortunate because this is exactly the kind of game I love replaying for simple kill 3 enemy with this weapon type achievements, but there's no such fun to be had here. Sometime in the late game, Wolfenstein as a whole experience meshed for me. This isn't a game you play for the story, it's a purely gameplay-driven experience, and that gameplay is great. Like King Kong felt like a playable pulp novel, this game feels like a playable cheesy comic book from the 1940s. Tales of horror by way of Indiana Jones. Nazis, ghost dimensions, evil experiments, and one ass-kicking American in a leather jacket with laser guns and superpowers. It's ridiculous, but unlike so many other games from the era, it resisted the temptation to turn itself into something more cynical, either through intense violence or trying to mature itself. That's not to say it's not violent, it absolutely is, but it's far from the savagery and machine games take. Wolfenstein 2009 isn't introspective, it doesn't have something meaningful to say about sacrifice, faith, and hope like machine games titles do. It's a game about shooting Nazis with laser guns. I don't want to sound like I don't like The New Order and Colossus, I love those games, and anyone who's seen my essay on them knows that. But those games are of such a different caliber and focus from this, and that's okay. Wolfenstein 2009 might not have been the direction the series would continue in, but as a strange offshoot, it's a wonderful gameplay experience and a memorable shooter that any FPS fan should experience. I truly hope that with the Activision merger, Raven and id Software's hard work on reinterpreting this classic franchise has another chance to live again, because looking back after so many years, Wolfenstein 2009 is underrated as hell and deserves a remaster or re-release on Xbox platforms that can hopefully iron out the technical issues for a more definitive experience. Hello everybody, and thank you very much for watching to the end of this latest shooter ranking series. I hope you enjoyed this special Halloween episode of the Shooter Ranking series, as I definitely enjoyed making it, and we are getting closer to the end of the month with our Halloween content. If you've noticed on the channel, it has been a very busy time, and I've already started working on my 2 next big video essay projects after the Matt Walsh videos. But unfortunately, I have run out of time in October, and some of the essays that I was working on just haven't been coming along like I'd like. So I do want to say that until further notice, the Silent Hill 3 video essay has been postponed indefinitely because I just haven't been able to bring the script to the quality of where I want it at. That doesn't mean it's not coming out. It put too much work into it already to just scrap it. It definitely is. I just can't say for sure when. That being said, there is still a Shadows of the Damned essay on the way, and I hope you look forward to that, as well as the next couple political essays, where I will be diving into the Daily Wire's new kids content and watching all of it and telling you all about it. So if you enjoy all of my content, whether it's video games or anything else I do, please consider giving a few bucks down below or at the Patreon link to be listed here alongside the wonderful patrons who have helped me produce these videos. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, especially on all my gaming content, because it does not make nearly as much as my political stuff. And I'm still going to keep doing it, obviously, but it would be nice if it got like just a little bit more views, because I do this as a full-time job now. I do content creation for a job. And on that note, if you'd like to see some of the other content I create, go sign up and check out our Twitch page, twitch.tv/deaddomain, so you can come and chill with us as we play games and go over political streams, like we talk about hate groups sometimes, and do all sorts of other fun, goofy shenanigans. With all that out of the way, thank you again so much for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and happy Halloween!